Good afternoon and welcome to another Bright News discussion. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Sebastian Brock. So without further ado, I'm going to ask him to introduce himself, if that's okay. So Dr. Brock, how are you doing?
Well, glad to be here, and hello everyone. To introduce myself, well, I'm long retired. I used to teach Aramaic and Syriac in Oxford University, and I had that job for, almost half a century.
Wow.
And before that, I taught in Cambridge and in Birmingham.
Wow, amazing.
So I ended up in what is still the only post in Aramaic and Syriac in the country. So I was very fortunate.
Right. Yeah, great privilege. That sounds great. So I wanted to start out by asking what exactly the Syriac language is, and sort of maybe what it's related to, right? So
Very good. Yes.
yeah.
Well, Syriac is just a dialect of Aramaic. Aramaic is a sort of blanket term for a whole lot of different dialects over time and over space. We first know of Aramaic from inscriptions from about 1000 BC, and modern dialects of it are still spoken in the Middle East. So it's had 3000 years of written existence, and probably longer than that orally.
Right.
So Syriac is one of the literary dialects of Aramaic, and for a long time, Aramaic wasn't written down. From the first millennium BCE, we only know of Aramaic from inscriptions and from a few texts in the Bible, in Daniel, in Book of Daniel and Ezra in particular. But later on, in the first century BC, we have Aramaic from Qumran, a Jewish dialect of Aramaic. And then in the post-Christian period, we have the beginnings of Syriac, of Jewish Aramaic, and of Mandaean. Mandaean is still spoken in a modern form, and it's the literature of a religion, separate religion, or Mandaeanism, and that is flourishing in South Iraq, South Iran, and in Australia in the diaspora. So Syriac probably was first written down round about the turn of the Christian era. We have a few inscriptions from the first century, but it was probably later in the first century or even in the second century that it was adopted as the literary language for Christianity as it moved eastwards. Christianity moved westwards in Greek and then Latin, but in the Semitic languages, it moved in Syriac. And Syriac, or Aramaic as a whole, is a separate Semitic language. It's related quite closely to Hebrew, less closely to Arabic and Ethiopic. So that's where it stands. There are quite a number of Semitic languages, some of which are completely dead now, others are still surviving.
Right. Okay. Now, people have spoken about, Aramaic being spoken by Jesus, right?
Yes.
And, I guess my question would be, if Jesus spoke Aramaic, and that was sort of that would have been the lingua franca at the time, why does it get sort of supplanted by Greek, or what they call, I guess, Koine Greek, right? And that's the way the Bible is sort of transmitted in the in the Western world, right?
Well, that's a good question. It's pretty certain that Jesus spoke Aramaic. There have been people who've argued that he spoke Hebrew, or even one person thought he spoke Greek. He, in fact, lived in a bilingual or even trilingual society, but Aramaic would pretty certain have been the dominant language of the region. And the hints in the New Testament where the Greek gives the Aramaic word, which indicate that he spoke Aramaic rather than Hebrew. Now, the Greek Gospels weren't really written down in Greek until quite late in the 1st century. The Pauline epistles were probably the first, and he came from a much more Hellenized area. He come from Tarsus.
Okay.
But in between, there would have been oral tradition. And in the case of Syriac, the period of oral tradition was rather longer. And we don't know exactly when the Syriac Gospels were translated from Greek or written down. But in the oldest form that we have, there are a few very old manuscripts which contain what is called the Old Syriac. And this is usually thought to go back to about 200 AD. These Old Syriac Gospels are definitely translations from Greek, but they're very interesting because they reflect a lot of very early traditions which don't really survive in the standard Greek text.
Right.
So they have a special interest for textual critics, for students of the New Testament.
Okay.
And then later on, in the roundabout 400, the Old Syriac Gospels were brought closer into line with the Hebrew, and you'll find in the history of translation of virtually every into virtually every language that people want to get closer and closer to the source text. Right. And this process takes several centuries. The 7th century is the culmination in the case of Syriac. And there's very close translation of the Gospels in the 7th century, which for modern readers of Syriac is much more difficult because it's so Hellenizing.
Okay, right. Now, I know that in terms of, tradition, right? I mean, you speak about, the Latin West and say the Hellenized or Greek East, right? And then there's the Oriental Church, right? And that's I think that's still okay to say that, right? That's not a derogatory term. Okay. And Syriac belongs within that Oriental tradition that you spoke about with the Ethiopic and the and so at what point in time do you see sort of a splintering between these various groups or these various traditions?
Yes, that's important. For the first 4 or 5 centuries, the Latin West, Greek East, and Syriac Orient lived together, as it were, and they were in communion with each other. But in the 5th century, you have the 2 great councils, 431, Council of Ephesus, and 451, the Council of Chalcedon. And these councils were not received by everyone. Of course, they're received by the Greek and Latin churches, but in the East, there were a lot of people who were unhappy with the formulation.
Right.
And so in the course of the late 5th, and especially over the 6th century, you have a 3-way split in Eastern Christianity. And that split is really fossilized by the Arab invasions at the beginning of the 7th century. And so the situation in the 7th century is what you have today. that
Right.
the non-Chalcedonian churches really got forgotten by the other churches, partly because they were regarded as, well, some people thought heretical, others said schismatic. But the fact that they were under Arab rule, whereas Greek and Latin Christianity were not, they rather got forgotten in the general perception, historical perception.
Okay.
And so in many church histories, you'll find that the narrative is taken up to the Council of Chalcedon, and then it supposes that all is well from that point, and they jump to the Reformation. And
Right.
so you've lost 1,000 years.
Right.
So one needs to amend that bad view of history.
Yeah.
So this is what happened. The split occurred because of the difficulty of finding a satisfactory formulation for how you relate the divinity to the humanity in the incarnate Christ. It's not an easy matter. People came up with numerous solutions or attempts to solve it, numerous formulae, and Chalcedon in particular hoped to provide a form that would please everyone, but it failed to do so.
Okay.
And one other thing that one needs to remember is that the at that time, at the time of Chalcedon, Christianity had moved east beyond the Roman Empire into the Persian Empire. And these great councils were imperial councils. They were summoned by the emperor, and they referred only to the bishops within the Roman Empire. So the bishops outside the Roman Empire in the Church of the East had nothing to do with Chalcedon or the other council at Ephesus. But when they learnt about them, they weren't pleased. So those councils have never been received.
Okay. Right. Right. And so so in other words, they weren't informed about the councils, and they weren't invited.
They weren't invited and they weren't involved.
Right. Right.
Whereas the Syrian Orthodox were, for the large part, within the Roman Empire, and they simply disliked it.
Right.
The formulation, though they were quite happy with the draft. This is one of the tragedies of history. And the draft just differs from the final form in one letter.
Right.
In Greek. So that's ironic.
Right. Right. And what would that be? What letter would that be?
Well, it's the Council of Chalcedon came up with the formula that in the incarnate Christ was in two natures.
Okay.
And the Syrian Orthodox and others wanted out of two natures, one out of two natures.
Okay.
So in Greek, that's en and ek. So,
right. And you know, and I think for people today in modern times, like you know, and we would not consider that to be sort of such a trivial thing. Like we might say, well, what's the big, I'm scratching my head, like what's the big deal, right? But I suppose to them,
well, it was a matter of salvation. It was a matter of salvation. If I mean, still some people think like this today, but it's not a very satisfactory way of looking at history. That if you don't have the right formula, you're not going to heaven.
Right. Okay.
But in ecumenical dialogue in the present century and end of last century, 20th century, and also in some dialogue in the Middle Ages, people realized that if you take the effort to try and understand the other party or other parties, what they're really trying to say and what their problem with your formulation is, then you can see that everyone is actually trying to say the same thing, but they express it in different ways. So
Right.
in a way, it's very important, but it's equally important, or perhaps even more important, to look at how do other people really understand the matter. And then you'll find that they're actually saying much the same thing as you are.
Right. Right. Okay. Okay. Now, I know that there's a, there are terms for these distinctions, right? And it's like I believe it's called Monophysite, and Diophysite,
That's
right?
right.
Okay. And that, in the past, the West used to refer to um, the Monophysite, and maybe we can get into what those two differences are, the Monophysite and Diophysite. But I know that the way that the West used to refer to, or the Latin West used to refer to the Oriental churches was Monophysite.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. And that, I'm just gonna guess here. Monophysite would mean like mono, which means one, right? One nature, right? And then Diophysite is two, so that would mean two natures. So what is Diophysite? Does that mean like together, like blended together, or
Yes.
maybe you can walk me through that?
Yes, it's confusing, I know. And,
Okay.
scholars have changed or at least some scholars have changed their terminology, indeed, in the last 20 years or so.
Okay.
Now, historically, the Western churches and the Orthodox churches referred to the Oriental churches as Monophysite. The problem with that term is, although it can mean one nature, but it can also mean, it can also be misunderstood as meaning only one nature, that is to say, the divine nature. And that is a complete misunderstanding. And you'll find in textbooks, even by people who should know better, that this misunderstanding occurs. And so really quite recently, this new term, Miaphysite, has come in to separate the Oriental Orthodox churches from this misunderstanding of the term. So Miaphysite means one nature, Diophysite, two natures. So it's purely descriptive.
Okay.
And the Oriental Orthodox churches speak of one incarnate nature out of two natures, so out of divinity and humanity.
Right.
So one nature out of two. So this single word ek, en, out of, instead of in.
Right.
And
right.
So in modern ecumenical circles, it's very important to use Miaphysite and not Monophysite, because otherwise there's a danger of misunderstanding, and that danger has been all too much present in quite a lot of writing in the past.
Right. Okay. Okay. Now, I want to ask about the sort of the I guess the way that the Oriental Church transmitted the Bible, right?
Yeah.
I know that there's a form of the Bible known as the Peshitta. Is this
That's right? Yes.
Okay? And then there's another one called the Diatessaron.
That's right.
Okay?
Yes.
Can you speak a little bit about those two? I mean, are they? Would you say that they're different from, say, the way the Bible would have been transmitted in the, say, Byzantine, in the Roman Byzantine tradition, or?
Well, let's deal with the Diatessaron first. The Diatessaron was a harmonization of the four Gospels. So the narrative is put together as one book, as it were.
Okay.
Now, this was done by a man called Tatian around about the middle of the 2nd century. And at one point, it was quite popular, and especially in the Syriac-speaking church, where it was even commented on by St. Ephraim in the 4th century. But in the 5th century, it was regarded by many of the church authorities in the Near East, Middle East, as, well, not heretical, but not very satisfactory, and they wanted to promote the four Gospels.
Okay.
So the original form of the Diatessaron is in fact lost. So we simply don't know exactly what it was. We don't even know whether it was in Greek or Syriac, and there's a lot of controversy about that.
Okay.
What we do have are medieval harmonies of the Gospels, which may or may not have direct links with Tatian's harmony. And as far as the text is concerned, they probably do not. As far as the structure is concerned, that's possible. Okay. So anyhow, if you're talking about the Diatessaron, it's a harmony of the Gospels, which we simply don't have. Okay. We've got a medieval Arabic form, we've got medieval Dutch, medieval English, and medieval Italian. So
yeah. Wow.
Now, to turn to the Peshitta, the Peshitta came to be the term for the standard biblical text in Syriac.
Okay.
Now, in the Old Testament, the Syriac translation is made directly from the Hebrew, so it's separate from the Septuagint, whereas in the New Testament, it's of course from Greek. Okay. And so the Peshitta Old Testament is from Hebrew, Peshitta New Testament is from Greek. And so, but the whole Bible is known as the Peshitta, but one needs to make the distinction about their sources.
Okay. Right. Okay. Now, you had spoken one time, and I'm going to paraphrase because I'm probably not going to get the exact quoting right, but you speak about ways of knowledge or ways of theology being transmitted, so in terms of, like the Latin West, you said there's more of a focus on the legal tradition or sort of like a jurisprudence or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And then like the Eastern Orthodox Church, there's a greater focus on the philosophical, and then with the Oriental churches, and I don't know if you mean like specifically with the Syriac church or the Oriental churches altogether. There's a focus on poetry and transmitting an understanding of God through poetry and art and music.
That's right.
Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes, I like to make this distinction between the Latin West, the more legal approach to how you express Christianity and how your liturgical tradition works, and the Greek more philosophical in some ways, and the Syriac more poetical. Now, these, of course, very crude distinctions, and each tradition, in fact, has all the other characteristics, but it's a matter of emphasis. And in the case of the poetic tradition, this applies especially in the early Syriac tradition. And what we have there, which is distinctive, is the feeling that theology and Christology are best expressed not through prose, as one expects in the West, but through poetry. And the one person who is the marvelous exponent of this is St. Ephrem in the 4th century. And he is a very profound theologian, but at the same time, he's also a very good poet. So he combines these two roles. Of course, we have religious poetry all over the place in all three traditions, but it's very rare, and even in the Syriac tradition, it's very rare that you have, as well, theological structure hidden away under the outward form of poetry. And that is what I feel is the case with St. Ephrem. You have to read all his works, become familiar with all his works, and then you see that there's a substructure on which he's building, which, as it were, describes the interrelationship between the physical world and the spiritual world, between the world on earth and the world in heaven. And it's a way of seeing interconnections everywhere between the biblical text and one's experience in ordinary life, between the biblical text and the heavenly world, between past and present, so it's working on vertical and horizontal method. I rather like to use the analogy of a spider's web, a very elaborate spider's web. And of course, Ephrem's spider's web is extremely complicated. But as the spider's web, you can easily overlook it. But if you catch a spider's web just soon after dawn, so it's got dew on it, a little droplets of dew, then you can see it very clearly.
Right.
So Ephrem says these, he calls them symbols or mysteries. These he sees are present absolutely everywhere in the biblical text and in nature. But you can't see them unless you use your interior eye of the heart. And to see them properly, you have to have that interior eye seeing clearly, which means purified. So purified of sin and misconceptions and so on. So he has these two things: the structure of the mysteries and symbols, which are absolutely present everywhere, but to be able to see them and to find meaning, they're rarely pointers to spiritual meaning. And in order to do this, you need this what I call the luminous eye. He uses a specific term, the eye of the heart.
Okay. Yeah. Wow. That's pretty profound there. You know,
it's exciting. When I discovered this, I was very excited.
Yeah. Now there's two others, I guess you would call them Oriental doctors of the church, right? And that's Saint Isaac of Nineveh.
That's right. Yes.
Right. And Jacob of Syriac.
That's it. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Can you maybe tell us a little bit about those other two and like you know their relationship? Yeah.
Yes, these three writers, Ephrem, Jacob, and Isaac, my favorite writers. Ephrem belongs to the 4th century. He died in 373. We don't know much about him because his biography is from the 6th century, and it presents him as a 6th century figure. So you see icons of him as a monk, which he certainly wasn't. So the 6th century is when Jacob lived. He died in 521. So we've just had a 1500 years anniversary celebration. And Jacob was also a poet, but he was a preacher, and he preached in verse. So one doesn't expect to go to church to hear a sermon in verse.
Right.
But if you went to Jacob's church, you would.
Okay.
And he was marvelous at doing this.
Yeah.
And he would take a biblical passage, probably one of the readings from the liturgy of the day, and he would imaginatively represent it in a way that's both vivid and bringing it to life to the congregation.
Right.
And I must say, I find his very exciting reading. He can bring all sorts of things quite unexpected to life. And for example, if you look at chapter 38 of Genesis, you have the story of Tamar, who acts as a prostitute in order to have sex with her father-in-law.
Yes.
Now, that sounds absolutely shocking. And many people over the course of history have simply cut it out of biblical readings.
Right.
But if you read Jacob's homily on it, it's absolutely wonderful. He just transfers everything, so it becomes really meaningful.
Right. Right.
So I won't.
This is the story of this would be the story of Judah and
Tamar. Yes, that's right. Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I recommend reading his Memra, his homily. So he has that ability to make things quite surprising into really meaningful for, well, say, a modern audience too.
Yeah.
So that's Jacob. Often we don't know very much about these people's lives. We do know that Jacob lived at a time of great controversy, and this is the time of the Chalcedonian controversy, very bitter on some sides, but it's typical of Jacob that for a long time, no one knew whether he was pro-Chalcedon or anti-Chalcedon.
Okay.
And it was only when his letters were published in I think it was the 1940s, that it became clear that when pressed by sort of rather ardent anti-Chalcedon monks, he said, I really don't awfully like Chalcedon. But he took the view that Chalcedon was simply divisive. He actually has a homily against Chalcedon, but he's sad about it. He's not sort of attacking it for its doctrine, but he's saying that it was divisive. It shouldn't have divided people.
Right.
Right. Shouldn't have been.
That's a good approach. I think we should have today within the church.
Well, quite. Right? Yes, I like his approach very much.
Yeah.
And on to Isaac, we're moving a couple of centuries on. Okay. Isaac belongs to the latter half of the 7th century. He belongs to the Church of the East. So he was rather surprisingly born in Qatar, in the Qatar region, so in the Gulf region.
Right, okay.
In the 7th century, especially early 7th century, this was a great intellectual center for Syriac scholars of the Church of the East. Right. And he was the patriarch of the Church of the East, visited Qatar in the 670s. And he brought Isaac back, made him Bishop of Mosul, that's North Iraq. Okay. And for reasons that no one knows, he resigned after 3 months, and he retired to, as it were, the desert, the wilderness. He retired to a monastery in what is now Western Iran, not far from the Iraqi border, but we don't know exactly where it was. It was quite a famous monastery in its own day. And as a monk, he became a solitary, so he belongs to a monastery, and is attached to it, but he lives separately in a cell, maybe with a disciple outside the monastery, and he comes into the monastery probably at the weekend for the Saturday vigil, over Saturday night to Sunday, stays for the liturgy on Sunday, and then goes back. That's the standard pattern that we know was the case. And he has left a large number of discourses, monastic discourses, and most of these, or a large body of these, were translated into Greek in the monastery of Marsaba, that's just north of Jerusalem in Palestine, modern Israel. And once in Greek, they got into Latin, they got into Slavonic, and they have played a very large role in especially Orthodox monasticism in Greece and in Russia. So they've had a very wide circulation.
Right.
Now, in the 1990s, so some 30 years ago, another collection of his discourses turned up actually in Oxford in the University Library, the Bodleian Library. And these are some 41 new discourses. And shortly after that, a third collection also turned up with rather less number of discourses. I'm pretty sure they're all by the same person. They're certainly attributed to him. And the difference is that they didn't get translated into Greek and so didn't have the circulation. But they did cross the different church boundaries. And so the second collection and the third collection were transmitted, in fact, largely by Syrian Orthodox manuscripts, scholars, or scribes. And some of the discourses were certainly known to Chalcedonian monks, but Syriac-speaking Chalcedonian monks. Right. And so in the sort of the Middle Eastern area, these other two collections were much better known, but they didn't reach the Western world through Greek translations. Right. Now, at the end of the second collection, there is a very beautiful selection of discourses where Isaac hypothesizes, it's not so much speculates, hypothesizes that if God is love, which is his basic idea, how can you fit this in with the idea of an eternal Gehenna, an eternal hell? Okay. He says, if hell is eternal, God has been defeated in his purpose. So he says, in his view, there is some great mystery which is hidden from us, and that Gehenna, hell, is not eternal. There will be an end to Gehenna. Wow. Now, this goes, this idea is found in quite a number of earlier writers, very respectable ones like Gregory of Nyssa and some others. But in other circles, it was thought to be heretical because it got associated with the name of Origen, who was a most wonderful scholar, but he had speculations about the end of time, similar to Isaac's, but also about the beginnings of time and the creation of souls. And that's what really got him into trouble. Okay. Now, Isaac has nothing about creation of souls. He's not interested in that. So what Isaac says at the end of his second body of discourses seems to me wonderful teaching, but not everyone's agreed. And in fact, given rise to a lot of controversy, especially in very conservative Orthodox circles.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. Speaking of origin,
Yes,
I know he was actually in Alexandria, right? He was in
that's right.
Egypt,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Right. And and he he is not considered a saint, right? Within
Alas, yes.
any of the traditions. Yeah, yeah. Which I'm a little heartbroken by that, but
So am I, so am I. I
I'll,
agree.
I'll say less on that. But actually, that brings me to my next
Hmm.
question, which is the sort of influence or relationship that the Syriac Church in sort of late antiquity in the medieval age had with the other Oriental churches. So like with the Church of Malankara, the Malankara Church, the Coptic Church, and the Ethiopic,
Yes,
the
yes,
Ethiopian Orthodox
yes,
churches.
that's important.
Yeah.
Um, a lot of Syriac texts got translated into Arabic in the Middle Ages, and that included a lot of texts which proved very influential in the Arabic-speaking world. And once in Arabic, it was much easier, as it were, to cross ecclesiastical boundaries because you didn't have the problem of Syriac script and or Syriac scripts, because there are several different ones.
Right.
And so a lot of Syriac texts got into Arabic and had a great influence in the different Arabic-speaking Christian churches of the Middle East.
Mhm.
And also from Arabic, there were translations in the Middle Ages, later Middle Ages, into Ethiopic.
Okay. Mhm.
And so in Ethiopia today, there is a large body of literature, largely of a monastic character, which in fact goes back to the Church of the East, but it is traveled in an indirect way.
Right.
Through Syriac, from Church of the East to the Syrian Orthodox, then into Arabic, then into Ethiopic. Sometimes it's preserved the original names, sometimes it hasn't. Isaac survives with his name in Ethiopic, but there are others who the names have been changed.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Yes, if you if you're translating, in fact, in the Greek translation of Isaac, although the Greek translators kept Isaac's own name and kept the fact that he was bishop of Mosul, of Nineveh, but they did change the names of Theodore of Mopsuestia and Evagrius, who were not acceptable to Chalcedonian readers.
Okay.
So they became John Chrysostom and Gregory of Nazianzus. So you just change the names to some respectable people.
Right. That's a good way to preserve memory, right?
That's right, and good way to transfer really good text, important text,
Right.
to another language, and get rid of things that some people might object to.
Right. 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 Well, Dr. Brock, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me. I guess my last question would be, what sort of relationship do we see now with sort of the Syriac church in relationship to the other Oriental churches and the Roman church, and the Eastern Orthodox churches? Are there any attempts to try and yeah?
Yes. From an ecumenical point of view, there have been huge advances in the last, 70 years, I suppose. The ecumenical movement began seriously in the 1960s, and actually already quite early on, between the Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox, it was realized in these theological dialogues that underneath the verbal conflict of formulations, Christological formulations. They were both trying to get the same side.
Mm-hmm.
And so on a theological level, most of the problems of Christology have, from most points of view, been resolved. The two churches aren't, unfortunately, in communion yet, because that needs it needs a council on both sides, and
Right.
so far that hasn't. So that is a step still in the future, but there's no reason on the viewpoint of doctrine why they shouldn't join up. Usually people find that if you agree on something, then someone else will find something else to disagree on.
Right.
So ecclesiology is a real stumbling block now.
Right.
So
Okay.
from that point of view, there's been a lot of dialogue between. Now, what I forgot to deal with one aspect of your previous question about Malankara Church in India. Now, the church in India, Syriac-speaking church in India, historically has its links with the Middle East and with the Syriac-speaking Church of the East. We, in fact, know very little about the church in India till the Portuguese period, because records, it's very damp climate in Kerala, records simply haven't survived. We've got one manuscript, which is now in the Vatican, which is an lectionary, East Syriac lectionary, from, I think it's 1301. So we have to rely on travelers' tales. Right. From the Portuguese period onwards, we've got a lot of information, partly because more recent manuscripts survive, but also because there's a lot of documentation in Western sources. Unfortunately, the advent of Westerners, Europeans in Kerala, led over the centuries to, I think there are now 7 different churches of Syriac liturgical tradition in Kerala. So from one church, you've now got 7 different ones. And 2 of these are very large. The Syro-Malabar, which is in communion with Rome, and the Syro-Malankara, which is independent, and also the Syrian Orthodox church under Antioch, Patriarchate of Antioch, that's also very large. So you've got 3 large bodies and several much smaller ones. Yeah. And the literature from these churches, we don't really have very much in the way of indigenous literature. We've got a certain amount of liturgical poetry, and that's still beginning to come to light rather more, because many of these libraries haven't been properly catalogued. But there's no great author, though in modern times there have been very important figures. The Syro-Malankara Church had a very important Metropolitan Gregorius, who played a great role in the World Council of Churches. He was an advocate before the time for an ecological approach to the world, and so on. So there have been very important figures. Right. So that's what I've got to say about it.
Yeah. No, that's beautiful.
Back to your other question.
No, that's great.
Modern relations.
That's great. That's great. Yeah.
The great change in the 20th and 21st century is the huge emigration from the Middle East of Christians. From all different churches. And now it's pretty certainly the case that the diaspora is larger than those who still remain in the Middle East. So totally new situation. And this has had various effects. Of course, other churches have had large-scale emigration of Orthodox churches, but in the case of the Middle Eastern churches, this is a much more recent phenomenon. In the case of the Syriac churches, well, they had the massacres in the early 20th century, which involved them as well as Armenians. Then the political upheavals, the creation of the State of Israel, a huge number of revolutions and so on, and the present state in Syria situation.
Right.
So for all sorts of good reasons, people have emigrated. So North America, Western Europe, Australia, South America, all large numbers now. Now, this means from the church's point of view that this new generation has, for the first time, had the opportunity, or the children have had an opportunity of Western education. Mm-hmm. And in the case of those immigrants from sort of peasant societies, that Eastern Turkey, for example, this has been a huge change because whereas people I know whose parents were farmers and local builders, silversmiths and so on, are now highly educated. They're doctors, lawyers, even politicians.
Yeah.
So it's a big shift.
Wow.
And but from the sort of host country's point of view, this is also very important because it means for the first time, Western Christians have come into direct contact with Oriental churches.
Wow.
And so where that has happened, that has been often quite fruitful.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. The way that contact took place is not so praiseworthy, but
well, you're quite right. Sometimes it's been really disastrous, but it has the potential of being better.
Right. The outcome. Right. Yeah. Yeah. God can always take something negative and turn it into
the positive. Yes.
Yeah. All right. Well, I want to thank you so much again for taking the time to talk with me. I know we've been going back and forth, and I've been trying to get your attention.
I've been so elusive.
Yeah, but thank you for being so patient with me and
well, not at all. I'm delighted to be of use. Yeah. I hope I haven't muddled everyone too much.
Oh no. My audience will definitely enjoy this. They will learn a lot, and I have too. So I'm very grateful.
Good. Well, what I can recommend is read some of these great writers from the Syriac churches, St. Ephraim, St. Jacob, St. Isaac. There are now quite a lot of translations, especially of Ephraim and Isaac.
Yes.
So it's a good opportunity because although poetry sounds rather recherché, it's very beautiful, very profound, and Isaac's monastic writers sound rather specialized for monks, but in fact they're just as relevant, or many of them just as relevant for lay people.
Right. Okay. Well, yeah, I'll definitely do my part and read some of it and keep on promoting this. So
wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you so much again.
Good. Well, thank you.
Okay.